Welcome to the MS&Me Radio Network. The broadcast shows are for informational and entertainment purposes only. They are not designed to provide listeners with specific personal, medical, or counseling advice. Individuals with a medical issue should always consult their healthcare provider. MS&Me is not responsible for content of individual shows. The views expressed by show hosts or their guests are their own. Enjoy the show.
I'm John Strum, and this is RealTalk MS. It's June 19th. I'm back from vacation, and we have a lot to talk about. A couple of weeks ago, one of my guests on the podcast was Marques Jones, and we talked about MS Path to Care, a new online resource designed to empower people living with MS to become full partners in their treatment. Well, even before we met, I had known about Marques through his role as an MS activist. And when I met up with him at the Consortium of MS Centers annual meeting in Nashville, Tennessee, I learned that he had taken his role as an activist one step further, because Marques Jones is running for public office in his home state of Virginia. So I sat down for a second conversation with Marques to discuss how his role as an MS activist led to his candidacy and how his own MS diagnosis has continued to inform his business life and his political life. We'll get to my conversation with MS activist and candidate Marques Jones in just a couple of minutes. But first, there are a few other things that you should know about. If you're living in the United States and you don't get your health coverage through an employer, so you buy your health insurance on an exchange like millions of Americans do, and you happen to be living with multiple sclerosis or any pre-existing medical condition for that matter, well, your right to have health insurance is once again in danger of being stripped away. Earlier this month, the state of Texas and 19 other states filed suit in federal court arguing that the Affordable Care Act, known more popularly as Obamacare, was unconstitutional. The Trump administration has filed a brief with the court in support of the argument that the Affordable Care Act is unconstitutional, and in their brief, the Justice Department has urged the court to throw out the Affordable Care Act's protection for people living with pre-existing conditions. Now, this amounts to a frontal assault on my family and every single family in the United States where one of its members is living with a pre-existing medical condition like cancer, diabetes, heart disease, MS, and too many others to name. So I'm not about to pull any punches here. In fact, I want you to take a moment and really let this sink in. The Trump administration has requested that a federal judge eliminate the protections that are provided by law through the Affordable Care Act for people with pre-existing conditions. Alternatively, the Trump administration wants to give insurance companies the right to charge considerably higher premiums should they decide to provide you with health care coverage at all. Well, the legal battle over this case is just getting started. California is leading a group of 16 states that are challenging this action in court, and you can be assured that this case isn't going to be settled anytime soon. So for now, the Affordable Care Act and all of its protections remain in effect. It should also probably be noted that according to the Kaiser Family Foundation, at least 3 in 10 adults under the age of 65 have a pre-existing medical condition. Having the court find in favor of Texas and the Trump administration would create an unprecedented healthcare crisis. That's why the National MS Society has joined forces with the American Cancer Society, the American Diabetes Association, the American Heart Association, and the American Lung Association in filing a friend of the court legal brief, citing the devastating impact that millions of families would face should the court invalidate the Affordable Care Act. When they filed their brief in federal court, This group of patient organizations, representing millions and millions of people across the United States, released a statement that I'd like to share with you. So I'm quoting now. The critical patient protections in the healthcare law provide an essential lifeline for millions of Americans who suffer serious illnesses like cancer, lung and heart disease, diabetes, neurological and chronic respiratory conditions. Their ability to access affordable, meaningful health insurance is critical to their health and well-being. Prior to the healthcare law, people who needed health insurance the most, older and sicker Americans, found it difficult or impossible to obtain affordable coverage. Denial for pre-existing conditions, outrageous premiums, and inadequate benefit packages were often the only available options. Without access to comprehensive health coverage they could afford, patients were often forced to delay or forego necessary health care. Before the ACA, more than half of heart patients reported difficulty paying for their care, and of those patients, more than 40% said they had delayed care or had not filled prescriptions. Uninsured patients with diabetes were 6 times as likely to forego necessary medical care than those with coverage. Uninsured patients were less likely to be screened for cancer and more likely to be diagnosed with later stage disease, which is harder to survive and more costly to treat. Since the law went into effect, uninsured rates have decreased more than 6% nationwide. This has improved patients' ability to prevent, detect, and treat their disease. Because of the ACA, there is already a small but statistically significant shift toward early-stage diagnosis for colorectal, lung, breast, and pancreatic cancer in states that have increased access to health care through Medicaid because of the law. The health care law, including the individual mandate, Medicaid expansion, tax credits, and patient protections essential to chronically ill patients, was intended to increase the number of Americans with health care coverage. Congress's refusal to repeal the law without an acceptable replacement confirms Congress's intent. The courts should respect the will of Congress. Tossing out the law would clearly ignore the will of Congress at the expense of 27 million Americans losing their health care by 2020, according to the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. We urge the court to uphold the law and recognize Congress's clear intent to improve access to life-saving health care for millions of Americans. Now, I'll include a link to the legal brief that was filed with the court in today's show notes, and you can be assured that we'll keep you updated on this case as it develops. I'm also going to include a link to the page on the National MS Society's website where you can sign up to be an MS activist. And if being threatened with losing your health insurance doesn't motivate you to want to advocate on your own behalf, then I'm not sure that I know what will. I'll add one more comment here. My focus on the podcast is, and has always been, to talk about the news that's going to impact people living with MS. Even when I talk about MS activism, as I often do, I try to do my best to keep politics out of the conversation. So, is talking about eliminating the Affordable Care Act and removing patient protections from chronically ill patients political? Well, unfortunately, today it seems to be. But I can't think of much that will have more of a negative impact on people living with MS than discovering that they no longer have access to the specialized care and prescription medications that they require, or that they have to go broke, liquidate their savings, destroy their credit rating, even lose their homes trying to get these things, because that's what life was like for millions of families living with chronic illness prior to the Affordable Care Act. To me, this has never been about politics. It's about providing care to those who most require it. So let me apologize if I've offended your political perspective. But speaking for myself, I'll continue to set the needs of the chronically ill outside the parameters of politics. Here's some good news because an MRI exam can be expensive even if you have health insurance. If you're living with MS, your neurologist may want you to undergo an annual MRI exam. The cost of that exam can be anywhere from $800 to more than $4,000, depending on where you live and where your MRI exam is being done. And by the way, that price doubles if your neurologist also asks for an MRI of your spine. So if you meet income eligibility requirements, the Multiple Sclerosis Association of America is stepping up to help with the cost of your MRI exam. They're expanding their MRI Access Fund program. So if you have MS and you don't have health insurance, the Multiple Sclerosis Association of America will refer you to an imaging center, and they'll pay the imaging center directly for your MRI exam. And if you do have health insurance, this program will cover the cost of your copayment, up to $600. If you'd like to check your eligibility and take advantage of this program, I'll put a link to the application in today's show notes. Over the past few days, the 4th Congress of the European Academy of Neurology has been taking place in Lisbon, Portugal. And at that event, Genentech, the pharmaceutical company that manufactures Ocrevus, made a few important announcements. Looking at data from their extended Phase 3 clinical study of Ocrevus in people living with primary progressive MS, researchers were able to extrapolate that Ocrevus may delay someone's need of a wheelchair for 7 years. Researchers found that compared to a placebo group, Ocrevus-treated patients had a 46% less risk of progressing to a wheelchair. So extrapolating that data, it showed that the placebo group, on average, required a wheelchair after 12.1 years, while the Ocrevus-treated group of patients required a wheelchair after 19.2 years. That's 7 more years of living and working independently and with far greater ease. And that's encouraging news. Genentech also announced that they were launching the first clinical trial that's designed to recognize the needs of severely disabled MS patients. Up until now, every clinical trial involving people living with MS had focused on whether the drug being tested preserved someone's ability to walk. So if someone relied on a wheelchair for mobility, they were automatically excluded from participating in any drug clinical trials. In fact, this perspective extends beyond just clinical trials. In the United Kingdom, the National Health Service stops treatment with disease-modifying therapies once someone loses their lower limb function and relies on a wheelchair. And the European Medicines Agency has also prevented people with MS who rely on wheelchairs from participating in drug clinical trials. This is a particularly challenging situation because there's growing scientific evidence that continuing treatment with disease-modifying therapies may actually delay the worsening of hand and arm functions. And maintaining hand and arm function could dramatically improve someone's quality of life and extend their independence. Since about a third of the people living with progressive MS are already reliant on a wheelchair for their mobility, this is an important issue. Genentech's new clinical trial is an international study that will begin later this year, and it's designed to evaluate the long-term effectiveness of Ocrevus in maintaining or even improving the upper limb function among people with progressive MS who are already reliant on a wheelchair and for whom the use of their hands and arms is critical. The study will recruit about 1,000 people living with primary progressive MS across multiple countries, and for the first time ever, the 9-hole peg test will be used as the main outcome to be measured in the trial. Now, the 9-hole peg test measures arm, wrist, and hand function by requiring the participant to take pegs from a container and one by one place them into 9 holes on a board as quickly as possible. Then they have to remove the pegs from the board one by one and replace them in the container. By comparing how well patients who are given Ocrevus perform this test to those patients who are given a placebo, the research team hopes to assess whether Ocrevus is effective in allowing MS patients to retain their upper limb function. I met Marques Jones at the Consortium of MS Centers annual meeting in Nashville, Tennessee, where we had a conversation about a new online resource called MS Path to Care. But even before we met, I had known about Marques through his role as an MS activist. When we met up, I learned that he was taking his role as an activist one step further, because Marques is running for public office in his home state of Virginia. So I sat down for a second conversation with Marques to discuss how his role as an MS activist led to his candidacy and how his own MS diagnosis has continued to inform his business life and his political life. In a moment, we'll meet my guest on the podcast, MS activist and candidate for the state Senate seat in the 12th District of Virginia, Marques Jones. I wanted to extend my conversation with Marques Jones. Marques was named the National MS Society's Advocate of the Year in Virginia in 2015. He's a member of the Step Therapy Task Force Advocacy Group, and Marques is an MS activist. In fact, he's taken his role as an activist a step further, and it's a very big step because Marques Jones is running for political office in the race for the state Senate seat in the 12th District of Virginia. Welcome to the podcast, Marques.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Something I read described you, and I'll quote now, as a genuine progressive grassroots activist. Is that an accurate description? And if it is, how do you define a genuine progressive grassroots activist?
I think it's an accurate description. I think because I didn't come up through a political system, I got involved in politics through my advocacy work. We did a lot of work in Virginia around Medicaid expansion and closing the coverage gap in Virginia. And that's what got me involved in politics. It was genuinely just wanting to do something good for the community. And then one day the light goes on and say, hey, I could do this. I don't have to be on the activist side of the table. I can actually be on the policy side. And instead of asking someone else to make the changes, do it myself. So, I think, when you talk about genuine, progressive activists, I think activism is just fighting for something that you believe in. You see an injustice and you say, I'm not going to let that stand. And you go and do something about it, because we can all shout at the TV screen. We can all throw down the newspaper and discuss. But, to actually go out there and do something about it, that's what makes you an activist. And that's what I try to be every single day.
So I know you were diagnosed with MS in 2008. I think you just partially answered the question, but how did you see that diagnosis change your life?
I'll tell you, it was, to say life-changing is an understatement, really, because when I was growing up, I grew up in West Virginia. Both my parents were teachers. My grandfather was a cook. My grandmother was a nurse's aide. And we didn't, we weren't poor, but we didn't have a whole lot of money to do frivolous things. So my number one goal when I went to college was, I'm going to graduate with a computer science degree and I'm going to be a software engineer and I'm going to make a ton of money. Right. And that, that was kind of my mindset. And I was the guy that I was at the office by 7 and stayed until I got everything done. And then when I was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, I took a step back and I kind of asked myself, what do I want to be remembered for? When my children and children's children are standing at my bedside and the doctor tells them that, it's a foregone conclusion, I'm going to take my last breath. None of them are going to sit around and say, he was a great software engineer, he's a great project manager. I want them to be able to say, he tried his best every single day to have a positive impact on his community. And not just for himself, but for others. Because let's be honest, I worked for a top 5 bank. We had awesome health insurance. I could afford to get the best treatment money could buy. but everybody can't afford to do that. It was a 2-year journey for me to get diagnosed. I went to 5 neurologists. I went to a cardiologist and got a stress test. I was poked and prodded. And if I didn't have access to health insurance, I would have never gotten my diagnosis. I would have never went the first time. So when I saw a problem in Virginia where there is about 400, 500,000 people that could be positively affected by expanding Medicaid in Virginia, I had to try to do something. And by taking that one step, that just kind of opened the floodgates for me to start getting more involved and more involved and more involved. And, you know, that's kind of the long and the short of it.
Well, we're going to come back to Medicaid expansion in a moment. But I'm wondering if you could tell me a little bit about what the Step Therapy Task Force is all about.
Wow. So in Virginia, what we wanted to do was we wanted to put some guardrails around how long it took you to get through that step therapy protocol. You know, we don't want in project management. I did project management for a lot of years when I worked for a bank, and we called it fail fast, right? So you try something, you know, and it doesn't work. You don't just keep on churning on. You try something new. But it felt like to me in step therapy, they tried to get you to fail as slow as possible because they, you know, for every day delayed, that's money that the insurance company saved. So we weren't trying to get them to get rid of step therapy. We just wanted them to put some guardrails around it to say you could go through that, you know, process quicker. Right. And we've been advocating for that for a couple of years now. And we're hoping with the change in the makeup in the legislature in Virginia, next cycle, we can get that done.
You're also the founder and president of Comfort Care Home Care of Northwest Richmond. Do you think your MS diagnosis has influenced how you approach the whole subject of at-home care?
So when I left my job last year, it was 2 years. When I left my job at the bank last year, it was 2 years in the making. When I started doing volunteer work for the National MS Society, one of the biggest complaints I would hear, and then I'd go back and research, was home care. You know, the aides not showing up, the companies not having any type of quality assurance program around what they were doing. And I thought to myself, it'd be great if someone who could literally see themselves in those people's shoes were actually running the company. So I did a lot of research, and I felt like since I didn't have a medical background, it probably wouldn't have been smart for a father of 3, a husband and a father of 3 to start a home care company from scratch. So I decided, you know, maybe purchasing an existing company was the best thing for me to do. But as you said, it does change the way I look at providing service for my clients, right? We make sure that we do, you know, background checks, both federal and state, on every employee. We make sure we check driving records. We do personality assessments. We do 2 skills assessments. We make sure that someone that we're sending into your home is top flight, that I would have them into my home. And I think you can say that you're going to do that when you're not affected. But for someone like me who could literally, I mean, let's be honest, I could wake up a month from now and need an aid. And people say, oh, you look great. That's, you know, don't worry. No, literally, I could wake up a month from now and need an aid. So every patient, every client that I have on my roster, I'm going to treat them like I would want myself to be treated.
You mentioned Medicaid expansion a moment ago, and that's been a hot button issue for going on 4 years in Virginia. And yesterday, it finally got passed. So what does that mean for the people in Virginia?
Oh, God. I mean, if you look at a map of Virginia and you look at who are the biggest beneficiaries of Medicaid expansion, it's the rural areas like I grew up in Bluefield, in Tazewell County in the Southwest, right? Where they have what they call the RAM clinic. It's like a van that goes around, and people literally can see the doctor or the dentist once a year, right? To have Medicaid be expanded and for people to be able to go to the doctor and get that preventative care to to allow them to avoid the catastrophic illnesses that come down the road when you don't take care of yourself. I think that's priceless. I really do think it's priceless. Not to mention from a fiscal standpoint, in Virginia, we had all the taxes, that every other state had when the Affordable Care Act was passed. The only difference was we weren't receiving any other benefit. Kentucky was receiving the benefit. West Virginia was receiving the benefit. But all of our Virginia's taxpayers' money was going to the other states. And now, the way the budget works, now that money comes in and we can spend more money on schools and teacher pay and other things like that. I mean, that's huge. That's really huge.
Speaking of the previous and current makeup of the Virginia legislature, in the 12th district, you're going to be facing Siobhan Dunavant, a Tea Party Republican. So what should the voters know in order to cast the right vote in the 12th district next year?
Dr. Dunavant's a great person. Truly. She's a good person. But her priorities lie with the Republican Party and their hard right orthodoxy, right? My priorities lie with the citizens of the 12th district and the citizens of Virginia. I'm doing what's best for them. Some in her wing of the Republican Party believe that the government should be run like a business. I believe government is there to serve the people. And every decision I make is going to be to benefit the citizens, the people, our neighbors. It's not going to be to benefit fossil fuel companies. It's not going to be to benefit special interest groups. It's going to be to benefit my neighbors that live on my street, that send kids to the elementary school, that need to go to the doctor and get health care, that want to make sure that we do something to reduce the rate of incarceration, criminal justice reform, that we're not sending people to jail for minor infractions. Like my whole goal is to make the people's lives better and not the corporations' lives better. And I think that's the purpose of government. The purpose of government is not so that a bunch of CEOs can get rich. The purpose of government is not so that politicians can get rich, right? Or can have access to power. The purpose of government is to provide a stable community for the people and to allow them to achieve their dreams. It's not to give them their dreams. That's not the purpose. But it's to provide the environment so that they can achieve their dreams if they so choose. And, that's what I'll work every day to do. I'll say one more thing. I think it's important for people with chronic illnesses and disabilities or the differently abled to take their seat at the table in government. Like, we have to be in the room when a lot of these decisions are made. When the Affordable Care Act is being put together, not just our advocacy organizations, but us. We need to be in the room. When a state budget is being put together, we need to be in the room. I would encourage anyone that's in my shoes or other shoes to run for school board, to run for their local soil and water board of supervisors. Get involved locally. If you think about a board of supervisors, right? Board of supervisors is putting up your stoplights, putting the curb cuts on the street, putting sidewalks, making sure those sidewalks are maintained so that folks, with MS can use their scooters and wheelchairs to go out and have some fresh air. These things are really important. And if I can do anything, it's to kind of show folks that, maybe a little bit differently able, maybe have a chronic illness, is that we have something to offer in government, and we don't have to just ask others to speak on our behalf, that we can speak for ourselves. And if nothing else comes out of this, I think that's at the top of my list.
Well, I think that the people in the MS community have already benefited from your activism, and I hope that the people of Virginia are going to be the future beneficiaries of your activism.
Thank you. And if you would like to donate to my campaign, please feel free to go to www.marquesjones.com. That's MarquesJones.com. Look over my platform, and hopefully you'll feel free to give me a nickel or two, because elections are expensive, and you can't do it without money, as much as I wish that we could take a lot of money out of politics. So thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you, Marques. And that's going to wrap up this week's episode of Real Talk MS. If you haven't subscribed to the podcast, I invite you to do so. You can find Real Talk MS wherever you find the best podcasts, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Play Music. And if you have an Amazon Echo or Echo Dot at home, you can just say, Alexa, enable the Real Talk MS podcast. My name is John Strum. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.